Welcome, the anointed ones. This message isn't just a video, it's a divine activation. If you're watching this, it's because something in your soul already knew the truth, long before your mind could explain it. Before we dive deeper, I want to take a moment to say thank you to everyone who's supported this space through super thanks. Your generosity, your belief, your spiritual alignment, it means more than words can express. And even if you've never given a single cent, I need you to know, your presence is deeply valued. Whether you donate or not, I honor you. This message is for every chosen one on this journey, seen or unseen, supported or misunderstood, rising. Anyway, some people studied you like a case file, underestimated you like a child fumbling in the dark. But what they didn't realize was that the whole time they were analyzing you, you were evolving. They thought you were confused, emotional, broken, or naive. But in truth, you were downloading wisdom from higher dimensions. You weren't asking surface questions. You were decoding generational bondage. You weren't just walking away from people, you were walking away from patterns. You saw what most never do, the illusion behind the comfort, the manipulation behind the mask, the spell behind the smile. You didn't expose them by raising your voice or clapping back online. You didn't send long messages, demand justice, or beg for understanding. You healed, you aligned, you elevated, and the moment you did, their chaos lost its grip. Their mask began to slip, not because you called it out, but because your energy no longer matched the vibration they needed to survive. That's what's shaking them now. It's not just that you left, it's that you saw through it all and never looked back. So drop a 777 inch the comments if this word hits something ancient inside you, if you've ever been laughed at, lied on, or counted out, but kept rising. Anyway, this space is yours. Share this with someone else who's been moving in silence and needs the reminder that their evolution is more powerful than any attack. You were never just a survivor. You were the prophecy they didn't see coming. And now you're walking in it, and they're finally starting to realize they should have never underestimated the chosen, God's chosen ones. They're in total shock. How did you uncover what was hidden? Number 1, you decoded the lie while they were still worshipping it. Chosen one. There comes a moment in every warrior's life when the illusion finally begins to crack. For you, that moment didn't come with a loud revelation or a lightning bolt from heaven. It came in whispers, in tiny clues, in gut feelings that couldn't be explained. While they were still clapping for the lie, you were already starting to notice the seams unraveling. Have you ever wondered why you were the only one who seemed to sense the contradiction? Why did you question things that others blindly accepted? While they celebrated the illusion as truth, you were the one quietly sitting with the discomfort, letting the questions rise. You paid attention when others tuned out. You noticed patterns in their stories, moments when their actions betrayed their words. It wasn't that you were paranoid, it was that your spirit refused to sleep through deception. They mistook your silence for submission. They assumed your loyalty meant blindness. But you were never truly asleep, were you? You were just watching, learning, gathering evidence. Not to confront, but to understand. That's what set you apart. Most people, when faced with uncomfortable truths, retreat into the safety of denial. But you leaned in. You didn't flinch. You let it all unravel. Even when the truth was painful, especially when it was painful, you saw how manipulation was wrapped in affection, how guilt was used as a leash, how control was masked as care. And instead of reacting impulsively, you sat in the discomfort and studied the game. You didn't just wake up, you evolved. This is the kind of discernment Esther had. She was placed in a palace where everyone wore a mask, where deception was normal and truth was dangerous. But she saw through it. She recognized that timing and silence were sometimes more powerful than confrontation, and like her, you moved strategically, not emotionally. The Bible says in Proverbs 25:2, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. To search out a matter is the glory of kings." You earned your royalty by investigating what others refused to look at. And when the pieces finally came together, it wasn't a moment of vengeance, it was a moment of awakening. They never imagined you'd figure it out because they built the illusion, assuming you'd never question it. But chosen ones don't just question. We discern. We dig. We endure. Think of whistleblowers like Erin Brockovich, who uncovered environmental corruption while the world praised the very institutions responsible. Like her, you weren't handed the truth, you hunted it. And that makes people nervous, because someone who can see through the performance can't be controlled by it. In John 16:13, Jesus promised, "But when He, the Spirit of truth, comes, He will guide you into all the truth." That Spirit has been guiding you the whole time. Every gut feeling, every sleepless night, every moment where you felt crazy for noticing something off, He was there, confirming what your spirit already knew. They thought you were losing your mind, but in reality, you were regaining your soul. Look at Malcolm X. Once he discovered how deeply he had been lied to, he didn't crumble. He transformed. He evolved into a sharper, clearer version of himself. You've done the same. You didn't just survive the illusion, you transcended it. Ephesians 5:13 says, "Everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes a light." You are the light now, chosen one. You're the living evidence that the system can be decoded, that the lie can be unmasked. And the wildest part, you did it without a support group, without applause, without confirmation. You did it alone, in silence, in pain, and you still came out with clarity. They're stunned because most people never escape the illusion. They conform, they stay numb, but you broke the cycle. You traded acceptance for truth. You stopped needing approval to validate your path. And in doing so, you exposed the system not through drama, but through discernment. You're not a magician. You're not a rebel. You're awake. And that, chosen one, is the most powerful thing you could ever be. Number 2. You became fluent in energies they can't even sense. Chosen one. What does it feel like to walk into a room and know something is wrong before a single word is spoken? What's it like to sense betrayal before it's confessed? To feel dishonor beneath a compliment? To catch the chill of jealousy in a warm smile? While others judge the surface, you read the current beneath. You've stopped relying on what people say and started tuning into what they carry. Your gift isn't loud, but it's unshakable. You're fluent in a language they don't even know exists. The language of energy, of vibration, of spirit. And that fluency was earned, not given. This discernment came from the battlefield of your life. It wasn't taught in books. It was carved into your soul by betrayal, gaslighting, and spiritual warfare. You learned to listen when no one was speaking. You began to trust your intuition even when facts were missing, because time and time again, your spirit was right while the evidence came too late. That's why people fear you now. They don't know how you know. But you know, you just know. 1 John 2:27 reminds us, the anointing you received from him remains in you. And you do not need anyone to teach you. You've been trained by the Spirit himself. That's why their tricks don't work anymore. That's why their charm can't distract you. You don't get seduced by charisma. You seek character. You don't get excited by attention. You assess intention. That inner radar, it's not paranoia. It's protection. Consider Maya Angelou, who famously said, "When people show you who they are, believe them. But chosen ones like you don't even wait for them to show it. You sense it. You discern motives before they manifest. You don't argue or chase explanations. You simply step back and let their masks slip in your absence." Hebrews 4:12 says, "For the word of God is alive and active. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart." That's what your spirit does now. You don't just hear noise, you feel alignment. You don't need an apology to know someone's spirit has turned. And once you know, you move in silence. Princess Diana once described how the palace was full of protocol, but empty of genuine warmth. She said she could feel the walls watching her. You've been in rooms like that too, where everything looked right but felt wrong. And instead of second-guessing yourself, you chose to trust your sensitivity. That's your power. 1 Corinthians 2:15 declares, "The person with the Spirit makes judgments about all things." That's you. You judge wisely, even without proof. And that unsettles people who are used to fooling others with image. But you've stopped judging by appearance. You judge by presence, by essence, by alignment. Remember Bruce Lee. His philosophy was to feel rather than think in combat. You're doing the same in spiritual warfare. You sense shifts before they become storms. You dodge traps before they spring. You pull back, not in fear, but in mastery. Isaiah 11:2-3 speaks of the Spirit of the Lord resting on the chosen, giving wisdom, understanding, and not judging by what he sees with his eyes or hears with his ears. That's your gift. You're not being emotional. You're being prophetic. So now they call you too intense, too spiritual, too much. But what they really mean is they can't fool you. They don't know how you knew what they tried to hide. And the truth is, it was never about logic. It was always about light. You're not guessing anymore. You're reading spirits. And once a chosen one starts doing that, no one can hide in the dark for long. Number 3, you outsmarted generational mind control without a manual. Chosen one. Let's begin with a question. How do you dismantle a system when you were born inside of it, before you had words to describe your thoughts? You were already being taught which emotions were acceptable, which people to trust, and what topics were off limits from your earliest moments. Your soul was surrounded by rules that didn't always make sense, but they were enforced with such certainty. You dared not question them. You weren't just born into a family or a culture. You were born into a program, a multi-generational code of silence, shame, and survival that everyone around you obeyed without thinking. And yet, somehow you thought. You looked around and started to notice. Why is silence expected after betrayal? Why is loyalty demanded more than honesty? Why are those who break people the loudest about keeping the family together? You didn't ask these questions out of rebellion. You asked them because your spirit refused to be muzzled. Most people spend their lives passing down pain they've renamed tradition. They defend emotional manipulation as discipline. They protect abusers in the name of family. But not you. You started to listen to the tension in your own chest. You listened to the screaming truth in your spirit. And in doing so, you committed an act of holy rebellion. Jesus said in Matthew 10:36, "A man's enemies will be the members of his own household." That verse hits differently when you realize that your first battlefield was your family. And what makes your journey even more powerful is this: you did it without a manual. No therapist guided you. No elders protected you. You became your own soul surgeon, cutting through generational dysfunction with nothing but intuition, courage, and pain. Consider the story of Frederick Douglass, born into slavery. He was taught that questioning authority was dangerous, that reading was forbidden, and yet he taught himself to read in secret. That knowledge became the seed of his freedom. Like you, Douglass dismantled a system that tried to keep him mentally shackled. He wasn't handed liberation, he pursued it. That's what you did. You broke a cycle most never escape. They don't understand how you think the way you do, how you see through guilt trips, how you refuse to be manipulated by obligation. But that's because you've done the inner excavation. You've seen the blueprint. You've decoded the gaslighting. You recognize emotional blackmail dressed up as concern. And now, they don't know what to do with you. Because the old scripts no longer work. They're using tactics that once controlled you, but now, you don't even flinch. Romans 12. Deux Romains. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's exactly what happened. Your mind was renewed not by religion, not by routine, but by revelation. You didn't just change your behavior, you changed your programming. You rewrote your mental operating system. That's not regular. That's spiritual intelligence. Think of Malala Yousafzai. In a society that told her girls couldn't learn, she risked everything to pursue education. Her resistance to mental conditioning changed the world. And though your battle may not be in the headlines, it's just as historic in the spirit. You ended what others were too afraid to name. Every time you said, "This ends with me," heaven took notice. Every time you questioned the normal way of things, you were being realigned with divine truth. In 2 Corinthians 10:4, -5, Paul writes, "The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. They have divine power to demolish strongholds." That's what you've been doing, demolishing strongholds that held generations captive. And it wasn't easy. The nights were long. The doubt was loud. You had to unlearn love that looked like control. You had to forgive people who never apologized. You had to trust your spirit when it screamed, "This isn't love. This is manipulation." And you walked away not because you didn't care, but because you finally did. The story of Simone Biles stepping away from Olympic competition is a modern example of reclaiming mental sovereignty. She chose wholeness over applause. You did too. You walked away from what was comfortable in order to heal what was generational. That takes more courage than most will ever understand. Isaías 61:4 declares, "They will rebuild the ancient ruins and restore the places long devastated." You, chosen one, are a restorer, a pattern breaker, a spiritual architect. You've rebuilt your mind where trauma once reigned. You've turned inherited dysfunction into wisdom. You didn't just survive it, you transformed through it. And now they look at you calm, clear, untouchable. But they don't see the nights you cried, questioning your reality. They don't see the courage it took to say, "No more." They don't realize that you've become the thing they never expected, a free thinker, a soul they can't program. And that terrifies them, because deep down, they know You didn't just figure it out. You freed yourself. Number 4. You didn't just wake up, you remembered. Chosen one. Have you ever wondered why some truths feel less like discoveries and more like returns? Why some moments of clarity feel like unlocking something ancient, not learning something new? That's because you didn't just wake up one day and become wise. You remembered who you were. You reconnected with a frequency that's been echoing in your spirit since before your birth. And now, you move like someone who carries ancient codes in a modern body. This isn't arrogance. This is recognition. You're not reacting to life. You're navigating from memory. Spiritual memory. Soul memory. That unspoken awareness that says, I've seen this spirit before. I've battled this energy before. Have you ever met someone and instantly known you couldn't trust them without a single red flag? That's not paranoia. That's memory. The remembering doesn't come from intellect. It comes from a deeper place. A place books can't reach. Jeremiah 1:5 says, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. That's not poetry, that's a blueprint. You were formed with remembrance embedded in your bones. That's why you've never fully fit in. That's why shallow things bore you and surface-level conversations drain you. You're operating on an eternal signal. Take Nikola Tesla. He claimed many of his inventions came to him fully formed in visions. He said he didn't invent them. He remembered them. That's you. You're not learning truth. You're remembering it. You're not following trends. You're tracing frequencies from lifetimes ago. That's why they can't copy you. That's why they don't understand your clarity. You didn't Google this. You downloaded it from eternity. When others panic, you pose. When others react, you discern. They call it overthinking, but it's over-remembering. Your trauma didn't shut you down, it opened a vault. Isolation didn't break you, it refined you. Every betrayal peeled back another layer of identity, revealing the warrior beneath the wounds. Salm 139:14 declares, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. You were made with divine memory woven into your DNA. So no, you're not crazy when you say, this doesn't feel right. You're not being difficult when you distance yourself from people everyone else adores. You're remembering the danger behind the charm. You're reading the energy, not the resume. Think of Maya Angelou. Her voice carried weight not just because of eloquence, but because of depth. Her words felt like soul reminders. You carry that too. You say things that pierce people not because they're harsh, but because they're ancient truths that their spirit can't deny. And often, your very presence triggers people before you speak a word. In Ecclesiastes 3:15 it says, whatever is has already been, and what will be has been before, and God will call the past to account. You're part of that call, a bridge between realms, a vessel through which memory becomes prophecy. Remember when Keanu Reeves was asked deep questions in interviews, and he'd pause and respond with unsettling insight? It wasn't performance, it was presence. You move the same way. You speak with weight because your soul has carried lifetimes of knowing. You don't need a platform to be powerful. You are power in motion. You didn't get this from a YouTube video. You didn't get here because of a trend. This isn't manifesting. This is memory manifesting. This is spiritual data resurfacing because the time is now, and the people around you sense it, even if they can't explain it. That's why they stare. That's why they mimic you. That's why they whisper. You've remembered something they've forgotten. Romans 8:29 says, for those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. Predestined. That means your awakening was always coming. Your memory was always going to activate. The trauma didn't delay it, it triggered it. The betrayal didn't bury it, it resurrected it. Now, you move like someone on assignment. Your steps are intentional. Your silence is strategic. And your presence, it shifts atmospheres. Not because you're loud, but because your energy speaks truth that no one else is brave enough to say. You didn't just remember who you are. You remembered why you came. The world wasn't ready. But the veil is lifting, and now, nothing will ever be the same. Number 5. You played dumb long enough to study their whole playbook. Chosen one. How much strength does it take to act like you don't know what you already do? How much wisdom is required to remain calm while being underestimated, misread, and judged incorrectly by people who think they're 3 moves ahead, when in reality, they're performing on a stage you've already dismantled in your mind? From the very beginning, you felt it. The misalignment, the subtle deceit, the disconnect between what they said and what they actually meant, while others were impressed by their charm. You were analyzing the frequency behind their words, but instead of reacting, you chose something far more powerful. You went silent. Why didn't you lash out? Why didn't you expose them the moment they showed their hand? Because silence is a strategist's weapon. You didn't stay quiet out of fear. You stayed quiet out of intelligence, out of spiritual poise. You were downloading every contradiction, tracking every slip-up, every backhanded compliment, every guilt trip that pretended to be care. They thought your patience was naivety. They mistook your soft demeanor for lack of understanding. But in truth, you were playing chess while they were playing checkers. Proverbs 17:28-6. Even fools are thought wise if they keep silent, and discerning if they hold their tongues. You understood the value of observation. You didn't just listen to what they said. You watched how they treated people when the cameras were off, when the audience was gone. You watched how they shifted depending on who had the spotlight. You witnessed how loyalty for them was only a currency of control. And the moment you stopped giving them your energy, the masks began to fall, like Harriet Jacobs, who escaped slavery by hiding in an attic crawl space for 7 years, observing her oppressors from above. You used isolation as insight. She watched in silence until her freedom was guaranteed. You did the same. You let them talk. You let them believe they were smarter, stronger, more manipulative. But you were studying their algorithm. You were reading them like an ancient text. They don't understand how you knew exactly when to exit, how you made your move so clean, so decisive, without a warning shot. But that's the power of staying quiet long enough to see clearly. You weren't caught off guard by their betrayal. You predicted it. You saw it coming seasons ago. You just needed the final confirmation, and they gave it to you, freely, in their arrogance. In Ecclesiastes 3-7, it says there is a time to be silent and a time to speak. You mastered the silence. You didn't shout your wisdom. You didn't demand they see you. You just moved. That's what's tormenting them now. Not just that you saw through them, but that they helped you do it. Every apology laced with blame, every moment of hot and cold affection, every time they used vulnerability as bait. You recorded it all, and then you walked away without slamming the door. You didn't need revenge. You just needed clarity. Look at Alan Turing, the genius who cracked the Nazi Enigma code during World War II. His quiet, observant brilliance changed the entire war. But the people around him underestimated him deeply. They never imagined the quiet one would be the one who ended the enemy's communication network. You carry that same disruptive intelligence. You don't yell. You just decode and disappear. Romans 12:19 Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. That's what you did. You let heaven handle the justice. Your only task was to break free from the narrative they tried to trap you in. They thought they were writing your story. But what they didn't know is that you were the ghostwriter of your own destiny. Think of Princess Diana, who played along with the royal family's pageantry while privately building her own humanitarian legacy. When she left, they were stunned, not because she left, but because she did it with such grace. The people followed her heart instead of their titles. You hold that same quiet defiance. You never needed to prove them wrong. You just needed to stop letting them pretend they were right. You stayed quiet until it mattered. And now that you've moved, there's no resetting the game. They want to rewrite history. But you own the receipts. The record lives in your memory, and more importantly, in your healed spirit. That's what they truly can't understand. Not just that you saw through them, but that you stayed composed the entire time. You outweighted their manipulation. You outran their tactics. And now they're scrambling, trying to figure out where they lost control. Isaías 54:17 declares, No weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue that rises against you in judgment, you shall condemn. You didn't fight with weapons, you fought with wisdom, and now they're left weaponless because every tactic they tried was revealed and disarmed without a single shout. So if they're whispering now, if they're calling you calculating or cold, let them misunderstand you. Let them stay confused, because what you've just done isn't ordinary. You broke the illusion while pretending to believe it. You let them hand you the map, and now you've left the maze entirely. You weren't the fool in the room. You were the observer they should have never tested. Number 6. You listened to the pain they tried to drown out. Chosen one. How many people do you know who've spent their whole lives running from pain, who mask their trauma with distractions, busyness, validation, or self-righteousness? Pain is the teacher they refuse to sit with. But you did the unthinkable. You didn't run. You didn't numb it. You faced it. You let it speak. And in that sacred confrontation, you heard the truth they've been avoiding for generations. What happens when someone finally stops blaming everyone else? When someone asks, why do I keep attracting the same wound with different faces? That's the moment the illusion begins to break. Most people never get that far. They protect the lie because it's easier than changing the pattern. But not you. You didn't just feel pain. You interrogated it. You let it pierce you until the falsehoods fell away. And what was left wasn't weakness. It was truth. Psalm 34:18 says, The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. You were crushed but not consumed. In your lowest hour, when people told you to move on, cheer up, or just let it go, you did the opposite. You sat down with the wound, and the wound gave you answers. Nelson Mandela emerged from prison not with bitterness, but clarity, because he let solitude teach him instead of breaking him. You did the same. You weren't bitter about the betrayal, you studied it. You traced it to its root, and that root revealed generational trauma, buried shame, and inherited silence. Lamentations 3:28-29 says, Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust. there may yet be hope. You buried your face in the dust. You sat in the ruins, and while others saw brokenness, you found blueprints for resurrection. Think of Frida Kahlo, whose physical pain birthed timeless paintings. Her wounds became her wisdom. Her art was not escapism, it was remembrance. You, too, turned your pain into language, into spiritual sight, into power that doesn't boast but carries weight. Now, your energy speaks before your words do, because your soul has seen fire and stayed intact. You realize something powerful that most people aren't healing. They're distracting, they're avoiding, they're performing strength. But you, chosen one, chose real healing. Not the glamorous version, the kind where you question your worth, your memories, your entire foundation, and then decide to rebuild anyway. In 2 Corinthians 4:17, Paul writes, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." Your trouble wasn't meaningless. Your heartbreak wasn't wasted. It all worked to build a level of clarity few possess. That's why people don't understand your calm, your grace, your peace. It wasn't handed to you, it was forged in flame. Oprah Winfrey often speaks of how her childhood trauma became the soil of her wisdom. It's not that she ignored her pain. She honored it. She excavated it. You did the same. You stopped seeking validation from the very people who caused the wound. You turned inward and found God already waiting inside the silence. Isaiah 43, 2 Ashures. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. You walked through it, not around it. And what was consumed in that fire wasn't your identity, it was your illusions. You lost false versions of yourself, the ones built to be palatable, the ones built to please, the ones built to protect other people's comfort at the cost of your truth. So now you're different, not louder, not flashier, just deeper, more still, more sure. You're not afraid of discomfort. You're not intimidated by shadows. You carry the kind of power that comes from having nothing to hide and nothing to prove. That's why they're confused. How did you get so grounded? How do you carry so much peace and stillness when the world is shaking? Because you already did your shaking in private. You already wept, wrestled, and walked through fire. Now you're unshakable. You didn't run from the wound. You became the flame. Number 7. You made peace with being the villain in their story. Chosen one. What happens when the only way to find peace is to be misunderstood? How do you carry on when people you once loved label you as the villain, simply because you dared to choose yourself? That's the kind of spiritual maturity you've stepped into. You no longer chase explanations. You no longer beg for clarity or rehearse your defense. You've discovered the liberating truth that not everyone deserves access to your side of the story, especially those who never cared to hear it in the first place. And that is terrifying to people who relied on your guilt to keep their illusions alive. You didn't wake up one day bitter. You didn't decide overnight to walk away. This was a slow, spiritual breaking, a painful undoing of patterns you once clung to out of loyalty, but somewhere along the journey, something in you finally snapped, not in rage, but in revelation. You realized no amount of kindness could rewrite their opinion. No amount of sacrifice could re-earn their respect. And most importantly, no amount of explaining could make someone understand a truth they were committed to misinterpreting. So you stopped. You laid down your weapons. You stepped out of the courtroom where you were both the defendant and the jury. You made peace with the villain role they assigned you, and in doing so, you reclaimed your soul. Luke 6:22, -23 says, "Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you and insult you, and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day, and leap for joy." That's not just poetic comfort. That's divine confirmation. You're not cursed because they called you selfish or difficult. You're blessed because you no longer needed their validation to breathe. Think of Meghan Markle. The media turned her into a villain not because she did anything outrageous, but because she chose boundaries. She walked away from a palace that expected silence in exchange for privilege, and for that, she was dragged. But like you, she learned that peace is more valuable than public approval. That peace costs relationships, but buys freedom. They called you the problem because you said no without apology, because you stopped showing up in spaces that drained you, because you refused to carry the guilt of other people's dysfunction. And yes, that made you the villain in their story. But isn't it wild how easily people rewrite reality when they lose control of your emotions? Galatian Zun Dees asks, "Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings? Or of God? Or am I trying to please people? For if you were still seeking human approval, you'd still be stuck in that cycle, explaining, apologizing, repeating the same loops. But now you walk in alignment. You no longer perform for an audience that booed you for setting boundaries. You've discovered that the loudest critics are often the most dependent on your silence, but you're silent now for a different reason, not out of submission, but out of sovereignty. Steve Jobs was fired from the very company he founded. People whispered that he was difficult, uncompromising, too bold. But his refusal to dilute his vision made him a threat to people who preferred comfort over disruption. He didn't defend himself. He rebuilt. That's what you did. You stopped explaining and started creating. You stopped apologizing and started evolving. Isaiah 50:7 affirms, "Because the sovereign Lord helps me, I will not be disgraced. Therefore have I set my face like flint, and I know I will not be put to shame." You've set your face like flint, chosen one. Your refusal to be broken has become your superpower. Let them misunderstand you. Let them whisper. Their confusion is not your assignment. Look at Serena Williams. Her intensity on the court was once labeled aggressive, unladylike, emotional. But now, that same fire is recognized as excellence. What they demonized in her, they later tried to imitate. The same will happen to you. What they called difficult, others will call divinely clear. Your peace now scares them. Your clarity makes them spiral, because the old version of you, the one who needed to be understood, needed to be liked, needed to be chosen, that version doesn't live here anymore. You've traded that role for something sacred. You're not the peacemaker at the cost of your own soul. You're not the fixer of what was never yours to fix. John 15:18 reminds you, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. Being misunderstood is not a failure. It's a sign you're in good company. The truth is, they needed you broken to feel right. They needed you soft so they wouldn't have to be accountable. But you stopped serving their version of peace, and now they're left with their illusions and your absence. You're not bitter. You're free. And if freedom looks like being the villain in someone else's fragile fantasy, so be it. Because you're the hero in your own life now, and that's the only narrative that matters. Number 8. You caught the pattern they rebranded as personality. Chosen one. Have you ever looked back at a conversation and thought, that wasn't a joke? That was a calculated insult? Have you ever noticed how their quirky mood swings always seem to show up when you asserted yourself? how their "just being honest" comments always hit where it hurt most. For a long time, they fooled you. Their tactics were smooth. Their manipulation came wrapped in charm and coated in charisma. But you've grown now. You don't just hear the words. You see the agenda. You've stopped making excuses for dysfunction just because it came with a smile. At some point, you started seeing the repetition, the predictability, the control, what others dismissed as just how they are. You recognized as a strategy, a defense system, a way to avoid accountability while staying adored. That's not personality. That's manipulation with a mask. Proverbs 26, 24, 25. Vance. Enemies disguise themselves with their lips, but in their hearts they harbor deceit, though their speech is charming. Do not believe them. You lived this scripture. You felt the contradiction every time they weaponized your vulnerability against you. Every time they spun your boundaries into betrayal. Remember Anna Sorokin, the fake heiress who manipulated her way through New York's elite. Everyone called her charismatic, quirky, bold until the lies unraveled. That's what happens when the mask slips. And like you, many people around her knew something was off, but didn't trust their instincts. You did. You realized charm isn't character, wit isn't wisdom, vibes aren't values. You started watching the patterns beneath the performance, how their kindness always had a clock, how their generosity always came with a hook, and once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Ecclesiastes 1:9 tells us, there is nothing new under the sun. These games aren't new, they just wear fresh outfits. But your discernment now is too strong to be distracted by new packaging. You don't need drama to know something's off. You feel it in your body. You see it in their silence. You read it in the pauses between their words. Think of Anthony Bourdain, who often used his platform to spotlight unseen cultural manipulation, calling out the performance beneath the politeness. You carry that same energy. You don't just see people, you see systems, you see conditioning, and you're no longer willing to normalize abuse just because it's been dressed up as personality. In 2 Timothy 3:5, Paul describes people having a form of godliness but denying its power. These are the ones who say all the right things, post all the enlightened quotes, use spiritual language to avoid confronting real issues. You know the type. They pretend to be the victim when they're called out. They mask their dominance in passive-aggressive tones, and you, chosen one, have finally stopped playing along. You noticed how the jokes always came at your expense, how support came only when it served them, how they clapped for you when you stayed small but grew distant when you started standing tall. You tracked it, you named it, and by naming it, you broke it. Jesus said in Matthew 7:16, "By their fruit you will recognize them, not by their charm, not by their status, but by the outcomes of their presence, and their fruit, chaos, confusion, control." You no longer eat from that tree. You've unplugged from the performance, like whistleblower Frances Haugen, who exposed Facebook's manipulation algorithms. You saw the code running underneath, and you refused to be part of the machine. That's what makes you dangerous to them now. You don't just withdraw your energy, you expose the game by refusing to play it. Now they're saying you changed, that you're too sensitive, too spiritual, too serious. But what they really mean is, you can't be controlled anymore. And that scares them. 1 John 4:1 says, "Do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God." You've been testing, and most of them failed. Not because they're evil, but because they refuse to be honest. And honesty is your requirement now. They can no longer weaponize your empathy. They can't use your kindness as a gateway to your energy. You're guarded not with walls, but with wisdom. You don't lash out. You don't expose them. You simply stop feeding their need to be worshipped while abusing others in silence. And that's the wound. They can't heal from the fact that their spell no longer works on you. You broke the cycle, not with confrontation, but with clarity. And now, they're the ones stuck explaining why their personality no longer has any power over you. Number 9. You used isolation to build a private empire. Chosen one. What if I told you that isolation wasn't your downfall, it was your divine development? They laughed at your distance. They questioned your silence. They whispered behind your back, saying you fell off, that you were ghosting, that you'd lost your edge. But you weren't disappearing. You were reappearing differently, deeply, strategically. They thought you were hiding, but you were healing. You were in the secret place doing the kind of soul reconstruction that only the chosen are called to endure. And let's be honest, how many people could survive the silence that nearly broke you? They called it a breakdown, but it was actually a blueprint. It wasn't failure, it was formation. And you knew if you didn't step away from the noise, from the pretending, from the performance, you'd never find your real self. How do you explain that kind of divine withdrawal to people addicted to applause? How do you articulate a season of hidden warfare to people who only value what they can post? You don't. You let your evolution speak for itself. Jesus himself often withdrew from the crowds to pray. Luke 5:16. He didn't announce his solitude. He lived in it. He wasn't avoiding his assignment. He was refueling for it. That's what you were doing too. When others were chasing platforms, you were chasing presence. When they were networking, you were interceding. While they were performing, you were transforming. And that's the difference they can't explain now. Have you ever heard of Vincent van Gogh? Most of his paintings weren't praised in his lifetime. He died in obscurity. But during his deepest isolation, he created some of the most celebrated works of art history. Like you, he wasn't seeking attention. He was pouring his soul into the unseen. You did the same, but instead of brushes, your tools were silence, prayer, study, and discipline. You were crafting a spiritual empire brick by painful brick. Isaiah 45:3. I will give you hidden treasures, riches stored in secret places. And now it makes sense. The silence wasn't punishment, it was preparation. You weren't being buried, you were being planted. That loneliness you felt, it was sacred ground. It was where God met you, stripped you, and rebuilt you in truth. And let's not sugarcoat it, those nights were brutal. The silence was loud enough to break you. The loneliness ached in your bones. You felt invisible, forgotten, but still, you stayed. You didn't run back to false community just to feel seen. You didn't reconnect with toxicity just to feel comforted. You sat with the silence until it started talking, and it told you the truth. Think of Tyler Perry. Before his massive success, he lived in his car, writing plays nobody came to. But he didn't quit. He turned that isolation into a foundation. Today, he owns a studio larger than Disney and Warner Brothers combined. That's what happens when chosen ones embrace the dark season. They don't collapse. They create. You fasted. You wept. You prayed. You questioned everything. You let go of the people you thought would never leave and released the versions of yourself you outgrew. You dismantled the need to be understood. You found healing in solitude, not as a trend, but as a necessity. Psalm 91:1 says, "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty." That's where your real identity was built, in the secret place, not in stages, not in posts, but in private obedience. You weren't building for followers. You were building for legacy. And while they were watching stories online, you were rewriting yours in the spirit. Think of Beyoncé disappearing for a year, only to return with Lemonade, a cultural, spiritual, artistic revolution that shook the world. That kind of power doesn't emerge from exposure. It emerges from retreat, from study, from sacred silence. And now, they look at you with awe. You walk differently. You no longer explain your boundaries. You see deception faster. You cut soul ties without hesitation. They wonder how you got so deep, so wise, so glowing. But it wasn't a glow-up. It was a resurrection. It wasn't aesthetic. It was alchemy. Romans 8:18 reminds us, "I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us." That's the glory you're walking in now, not because it was handed to you, but because you cultivated it in fire, in silence, in surrender. And here's what they don't know. Your isolation wasn't selfish. It was survival. If you had stayed in those draining spaces, kept playing the role, kept giving access to people who only took you, would have lost your soul. So you walked away, not to prove a point, but to save your calling. Now they're watching. They're confused, impressed, maybe even intimidated. But the truth is, this was never about them. This was about your destiny. You weren't gone. You were growing. And what you've built in silence will echo for generations. Number 10. You crushed every label they weaponized against you. Chosen one. They tried to define you before you even knew your own name, from your earliest days. They threw words at you like darts. Too sensitive, too much, too intense, too weird. They wanted you to believe that your uniqueness was a liability, that your softness was a flaw, that your depth was a burden. And for a while, those labels hurt. They confused you, made you shrink, made you question why you couldn't just be normal like everyone else. But what they called weakness was actually a divine watermark, evidence that you were never designed to fit in. What if the very things they mocked were actually your proof of being chosen? They said you were too sensitive, but that was your discernment, your ability to detect energy shifts, body language, tone, and intention was sharper than theirs could ever be. They said you were too quiet, but that was your spiritual antenna filtering noise, protecting your energy. They said you were too intense, but that was your refusal to fake it, your demand for depth in a world addicted to small talk. And too weird, that was your originality, your resistance to conformity, your refusal to die in the boxes they accepted as home. 1 Peter 2:9 says, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession." They didn't recognize your royalty because you weren't wearing a crown. They were too busy looking for someone who fit their mold. But chosen ones are never molded, they're forged. And your forging came through rejection. Look at Lady Gaga, mocked for her outfits, labeled too weird by the media. But she embraced her strangeness and turned it into an empire. She made room for the misfits. You've done the same. You made space for your soul to breathe by rejecting the roles they assigned to you. Galatians 5. Uno declares, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm. Then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Labels are slavery. When you stopped accepting their definitions, you stepped into divine freedom. You began naming yourself. You stopped letting their limitations determine your identity. Think of Michael Jordan being cut from his high school basketball team. They labeled him not good enough, but instead of letting that break him, he let it fuel him. You did the same. You turned every insult into insight, every rejection into redirection. You realized the labels said more about them than about you. They called you too emotional because your presence made them confront what they suppressed. They called you intense because you mirrored their shallow existence. You became their trigger. But instead of making yourself smaller, you expanded. Isaiah 60 these promises. You will be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will bestow. That's what's happening now. You've shed their names. You've stepped into your real one, the one marked by purpose, presence, and power. Oprah Winfrey was told she was too emotional for television, too expressive. But those very traits made her one of the most influential communicators in the world. What they ridiculed in her, they now respect. And so it will be with you. The labels they used to shame you will become the blueprint others follow. And now they're whispering, how did they become this confident? How did they make it out? They don't understand that your rise didn't come from proving them wrong, but from finally believing you were never wrong to begin with. You never needed fixing. You just needed to remember. Romans 12:6 reminds us that we have different gifts. According to the grace given to each of us, your gift was always different, and that difference was divine. So now, you walk without apology. You no longer dilute your presence to make others feel safe. You don't correct your posture to fit their comfort zones. You crushed every label, not with rage, but with resurrection. They tried to bury you under their words, but you used those same words as stepping stones. And now, you stand above it all, untouchable, unmistakable, and undeniably chosen. Number 11. You didn't just question authority. You became your own, chosen one. Have you ever stopped to consider just how many voices tried to claim authority over your life before you even had the words to say no? From the moment you could walk, you were being shaped, molded, disciplined into a version of yourself that was more manageable, more compliant, easier to label and control. The parent who insisted they knew best, even when their actions said otherwise. The teacher who rewarded silence over curiosity. The spiritual leader who equated obedience with godliness and called your doubts demonic. The system that told you authority was something to obey, not question. You were taught that power lived outside of you. And for a while, you believed it. How could you not? The entire structure was built to make you forget your inner compass. So, like many, you doubted your instinct. You silenced your voice in favor of rules. You apologized for your wisdom. You bowed your head even when your spirit screamed. This is wrong, because deep down, you wanted to be good. You wanted to be accepted. And in a world that weaponizes approval, that desire became your leash. But something shifted, didn't it? Life pushed you into moments where those you looked up to proved unworthy of your trust. The people who were supposed to protect you either betrayed you or stood by while it happened. What happens when the people in charge stop making sense? When the sermons start to sound like manipulation and the rules start to feel more like shackles than structure? You reached a point where tradition could no longer explain your pain. That's when the silence came, the terrifying, hollow silence, where all the titles lost their weight. And in that space, you heard something new, a whisper that wasn't from outside of you, but within. You realized no one was coming to save you, and strangely, that wasn't a curse, it was a call. In Jeremiah 31, 33, God says, "I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts." That moment of realization was your divine turning point. You weren't meant to outsource your discernment forever. You were meant to awaken to your own divine authority. And that's what you did. You stopped deferring to systems that never held your best interests. You stopped asking if your calling was acceptable. You began trusting that inner frequency that had always been speaking even when the world demanded silence. Think of Joan of Arc, a teenage girl with no formal education or title, who dared to believe that God had spoken directly to her. She stood against armies and kings, not with weapons, but with certainty. You carry that same unshakable frequency. You don't need approval anymore. You've become your own compass. They called it rebellion. They said you were drifting, but what they didn't understand is that you weren't rebelling, you were remembering. The system lost its grip on you the moment you realized you were sovereign, not arrogant, not above correction, but accountable to something higher, your creator, your conscience, your calling. Galatians sank and reminds us, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm, then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. That yoke was psychological, spiritual, it was generations deep. But you broke it. You walked away from empty rituals and fake reverence. You stopped saluting authority that hadn't earned your respect. Look at Malcolm X. He was once a loyal student of a system that later betrayed him, but instead of staying broken, he evolved. He found his own voice, his own path, and refused to be silenced. You did the same. You became your own authority, not because you rejected guidance, but because you finally realized the true guide had always been speaking from within. When you stopped flinching at their disappointment, they panicked. When their guilt trips no longer worked, they scrambled. Because people who rely on control lose power when you stop needing their approval. That's why your peace makes them uncomfortable. That's why your clarity threatens them. You're no longer reactive. You're grounded. Souverän. Free. Proverbs 3:5-6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding, and he will make your paths straight." But trusting God didn't mean trusting every person who claimed to speak for him. You learned to discern the difference between real spiritual alignment and manipulative theatrics. You stopped letting people hide behind scripture to excuse their control. Now you sit at your own table. You no longer beg for a seat at someone else's. You're not trying to be accepted. You're rooted in identity. That's why their tactics don't work anymore. They can't shame you into silence. They can't guilt you into obedience. You remember who you are and who sent you. Like Rosa Parks, who didn't shout or argue but simply refused to give up her seat. Your defiance is quiet, unshakable. Your no carries the weight of generations healed. Your presence alone rewrites the narrative of submission they built around you. Ephesians 2:6 reminds us, "And God raised us up with Christ and seated us with him in the heavenly realms." That is your seat now, not one they gave you, but one you were always meant to claim. You didn't just question authority, you became it, and not in the way they feared, but in the way heaven intended. Number 12. You alchemized betrayal into a GPS, chosen one. What if I told you that the betrayal wasn't your end, but your map? That every person who lied, rejected, abandoned, or belittled you was unknowingly pointing you exactly where you needed to go. They thought they were sabotaging you. They thought their deceit would derail your destiny. But, in reality, their rejection was revelation. Their betrayal became your redirection. Have you ever looked back and realized that the most painful moments weren't setbacks but signs? That every loss was actually a lesson wrapped in thorns? The friend who vanished, the partner who cheated, the mentor who manipulated, it all hurt. But it also revealed. And when you stopped asking, "Why me?" and started asking, "What now?" everything shifted. Romans 8:28 assure. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. All things, not just the easy ones, especially the painful ones. Betrayal isn't random. It comes with strategy. It arrives like a test. But underneath it all, it's direction. Think of Joseph in Genesis, sold by his brothers, imprisoned unjustly, forgotten, but every betrayal was a breadcrumb to the palace. He didn't collapse in the pit. He decoded the path. Like Joseph, you learned to navigate pain like a prophet. You didn't just survive betrayal. You studied it. You asked, "What was this trying to teach me about myself?" And you listened. The lies revealed what truth felt like in your bones. The silence made you face your loneliness and call it by name. The rejection cleared space for real connections to form. You turned every dagger into a compass. Think of Steve Jobs, fired from Apple, the company he helped build. But instead of folding, he created Pixar. He reinvented himself and eventually returned to Apple stronger. The very betrayal that tried to break him redirected his genius. Salm 118, 22 declares, "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." That's you, the overlooked, the underestimated, the betrayed. And yet you became the foundation. You stopped needing apologies. You stopped chasing closure. You realized that closure is just another word for control, and chosen ones don't need closure. They need clarity. You got that. You understood that not everyone who betrays you is evil. Some are just ignorant. But even in their ignorance, they became instruments, tools. They served your story by showing you where not to build. Beyoncé's Lemonade wasn't just an album. It was a spiritual manifesto, born from betrayal. It became a roadmap of transformation. She turned heartbreak into empowerment. So did you. You turned the ashes into architecture. You took the ruin and built a throne. Isaiah, Echon Tenula, Tre promises. To bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes. The oil of joy instead of mourning. You've stepped into that crown now. Not because your enemies said sorry, but because you no longer needed them to. And let's not forget Maya Angelou. She said, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them." You did. And instead of staying to fix them, you thanked them for the revelation and walked into higher ground. Hebrews 12:11 tells us, "No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful later on. However, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace." That's your harvest now. Peace, discernment, alignment. Not because life got easy, but because you finally learned to interpret the chaos. So now, you walk like someone who knows too much to be fooled. You don't flinch when people leave. You don't collapse when plans fall through. You understand that every betrayal was a message, every heartbreak a doorway, and every detour divine. You alchemized betrayal into guidance, into purpose, into prophecy. You didn't just rise, you rerouted, and now, chosen one. You are exactly where you were always meant to be, on mission, in position, untouchable. Number 13. You exposed their spells by living in truth, chosen one. Have you ever seen darkness dissolve without a single word spoken? That's what you did. You didn't have to shout. You didn't have to defend yourself. You didn't go on a mission to prove who was lying and who was pretending. You just stood in the light, and that alone was enough to send every hidden shadow running. You didn't use confrontation. You used clarity. And clarity, in a world full of confusion and manipulation, is spiritual warfare at its highest level. They expected you to go off. They thought you would crumble under the pressure of their gossip, their smear campaigns, their psychological warfare. They assumed you would chase people down to explain, to justify, to plead for your side of the story. But instead, you healed, you got quiet, you turned inward. You started rising not in volume, but in vibration, and what they never prepared for was the day you would stop playing the game altogether. Salm 37, says declaris. He will make your righteous reward shine like the dawn, your vindication like the noonday sun. That's exactly what happened. You didn't need to argue your case. You just had to align with truth. And the lie began to rot on its own. People started noticing, without even speaking their names. You exposed their masks, their performances, their energy. The room shifted when you entered it, not because you said something powerful, but because your spirit was clean. Think of Princess Diana. She never exposed the palace with tabloid drama. Her silence, her poise, her inner glow dismantled an entire structure built on image. She lived in integrity, and the system couldn't handle it. That's you. You don't need the spotlight to shine. Your energy carries a frequency that makes anything fake feel exposed. You weren't trying to be the hero. You weren't trying to destroy anyone. You were just trying to survive, to evolve, to find peace. But in doing so, you stumbled into divine territory. Your peace became a prophecy. Your alignment became a weapon while they were still chanting, performing, manipulating the narrative. You were minding your business and becoming a mirror. Their deception stood out more clearly in your presence. Their chaos felt louder next to your calm. 2 Corinthians 4:2 says, "We have renounced secret and shameful ways. We do not use deception, but by setting forth the truth plainly, we commend ourselves to everyone's conscience." Your life became that plain truth. You didn't need a rebuttal. You became the rebuttal. You didn't lose sleep trying to undo their spells. You simply outgrew them, and that's what they couldn't handle. Because your silence wasn't submission, it was a signal that you had switched frequencies. They were casting spells in the language of drama, guilt, and confusion. But you stopped speaking that language. You stopped attending their emotional rituals. You stopped feeding their power with your attention. And once you detached, their grip began to unravel. Consider Colin Kaepernick. He didn't scream. He knelt, and his silence sparked a global conversation. He exposed systems of injustice simply by staying in alignment with truth. No drama, just dignity. You carry that same quiet boldness, that prophetic stillness, that authority that doesn't need a podium. Isaiah 54:17 reminds us, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue that rises against you in judgment you shall condemn." You didn't lift a hand. You didn't clap back. Yet somehow, every weapon collapsed anyway. Because truth has a frequency, And when you walk in it, everything built on falsehood starts to tremble. You became immune to their games. Their sarcasm stopped landing. Their passive aggression lost its sting. Their attempts to bait you into reaction failed. You elevated. And suddenly their tactics felt childish because they were. They used confusion as camouflage. But your clarity exposed every trick. Think of whistleblower Frances Haugen, who calmly revealed Facebook's internal damage without theatrics. Her truth triggered global awareness. That's what happens when someone refuses to play by corrupted rules. That's what you did. John 8:32 says, "Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." But here's what most forget. Your freedom didn't just liberate you, it exposed every lie that tried to enslave you. And those who were invested in your silence, they're scrambling now, because your truth won't let them hide anymore. You never needed revenge. Your healing was louder than retaliation. Your alignment shouted louder than your absence, and without ever uttering their names. Your life made their masks unwearable. Now they say, "You've changed," that you're different. But what they really mean is, you're no longer controllable. You're no longer operating on their frequency. You're vibrating on truth, and truth doesn't tolerate illusion. Like Nelson Mandela, who walked out of prison not with bitterness, but with a clarity that reshaped a nation. You've walked out of your own prison, and now, your life, you're healed. Whole. Vibrating in alignment life is the loudest declaration of all. Number 14. You were the prophecy they laughed at until it came true, chosen one. How do you explain to someone that your survival was never random, that every scar you carried was a symbol, that your silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy, that your isolation wasn't punishment, it was preparation? You've known it all along, haven't you? You were marked for something greater. Even when everyone around you rolled their eyes, they couldn't see it. You didn't look the part, you didn't have the status, the spotlight, the resume. So they dismissed you, mocked you, scoffed at your dreams and labeled your certainty as delusion. But what they didn't know is that you weren't chasing purpose, you were carrying it. You weren't making it up, you were remembering every whisper from heaven, every tug in your soul. Every sleepless night wasn't fantasy, it was prophecy unfolding in real time. You were never just reacting to life, you were responding to a divine script already written inside you. Jeremiah 1:5 says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart." They judged the package, but heaven knew the purpose. They saw the confusion in your eyes, the pain in your posture, the poverty in your conditions, but they missed the anointing in your voice. They missed the fire in your bones, because they weren't trained to recognize glory in disguise, like David standing before Goliath with nothing but a slingshot. They laughed until the giant fell. You weren't trying to impress anyone, you were trying to survive your assignment. And in doing so, you became the fulfillment of everything they said would never happen. Think of Elon Musk. He was ridiculed for his visions of electric cars and space travel. They called him erratic, impossible, delusional. Now he's reshaping industries. You too were mocked for dreaming beyond your environment. But those dreams weren't inventions, they were instructions. Isaiah 46:10 says, "I make known the end from the beginning. My purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please." Heaven wrote the ending before your enemies even entered the room. Your rise was scripted. Your name was already assigned to the breakthrough. And now, the very people who called you foolish are watching the prophecy unfold in front of them. You don't need a mic. You don't need a pulpit. You don't even need revenge. Your life is preaching. Your transformation is the sermon. Your alignment is the judgment. Every room that once rejected you is now haunted by the sound of your name, not because you forced it, but because prophecy cannot be buried. Like Maya Angelou said, "Still, I rise." You rose when they counted you out. You rose in silence. You rose in pain. You rose with no applause. And now, you are undeniable. Revelation 3:8 declares, "See, I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut." They slammed doors, but heaven opened another one. They laughed when you were locked out, but now they're banging on doors that no longer open for them. Not because you blocked them, but because your elevation is protected by design. Think of Malala Yousafzai, shot for seeking education, mocked for being just a girl, and yet her voice became global. Her wounds became wisdom. Like her, your pain birthed purpose. What they tried to destroy became divine proof that you were sent. Now they're scrambling, not because you've changed, but because you stayed true. You stayed aligned. You didn't fold. You let the rejection refine you. You let the delay shape you. And now you move like someone who knows. You don't need applause. You don't need revenge. You are the evidence. Every win you carry is a divine echo saying, "I told you so." End of John 15:16 says, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit." You were chosen, and now your fruit is undeniable. The blessings, the wisdom, the glow. It was never about proving them wrong. It was about proving God right. You were the prophecy they laughed at until every word came true. And now, they can't ignore you because you weren't a joke. You were a warning, a blueprint, a seed they tried to bury, not knowing it was born to rise. Chosen one. Let this moment sink in, not as a performance, not as a speech, but as a spiritual seal on everything you've endured, uncovered, survived, and risen above. You didn't expose them with arguments. You didn't win with confrontation. You didn't gather evidence or call for a crowd. Your very evolution did all the heavy lifting. The changes you made in silence, the healing you did in the dark, and the courage you cultivated in private, those were the weapons. And without lifting a single finger, you dismantled a web of illusions that had entangled generations. That's not just strength, that's divine intelligence. You didn't fight back with fists or retaliation. You didn't meet manipulation with more chaos. Your discernment, your boundaries, your stillness, those were your defense. And it was more than enough. It wasn't revenge that made them tremble. It was the way your peace exposed their panic. It was your healing that made their curses collapse. It was your silence that spoke louder than any accusation they tried to make stick. Every time you chose truth over ego, alignment over applause, purpose over pettiness, you wrote a new script for your lineage. And now, those who once mocked you, dismissed you, gossiped about you, and underestimated, you are left staring at a reality they never imagined. You knew all along. You knew. But how did you know? That's the question echoing in their minds now. And the truth is, it wasn't a textbook. It wasn't a viral quote. It wasn't someone whispering in your ear. It was your DNA whispering through dimensions. It was your ancestors speaking through the silence. It was your trauma teaching you the patterns that could no longer continue through your bloodline. It was the voice of God speaking not through thunder, but through stillness. You weren't just reacting, you were remembering, you were aligning, you were becoming. Your isolation wasn't exile, it was initiation. Your loneliness wasn't punishment, it was preservation. And every time they insulted you, doubted you, left you out, or misused your loyalty, they thought they were breaking you. But you turned every insult into fuel. You turned every trap into a stepping stone. You turned every setback into a supernatural setup. And now, here, you are not just the one who survived, but the one who was sent to shift the entire frequency of the space. You are not just the one who figured it out. You are the reason it was exposed in the first place. Your presence disturbs the false. Your aura convicts hidden agendas. Your vibration demands truth without you ever needing to say a word. You don't need a microphone. You don't need a spotlight. Your obedience to your inner truth does the work that sermons and speeches never could. You are the clarity in a world of confusion. You are the echo of divine order in a system built on deception. And now that you've stopped apologizing for your discernment, your very existence commands respect. They can't joke the same way around you anymore. Their sarcasm misses. Their manipulation bounces off. Their passive-aggressive remarks sound like static in your peace. Because the frequency you're walking in now, it's different. It's not just confidence. It's calling. It's not just intuition. It's inheritance. And they're finally starting to realize you weren't reacting. You were responding to a spiritual script that was already written. You weren't the fool in the story. You were the prophecy in disguise. So to every chosen one watching this right now, hear me when I say, if they're in awe of you now, just wait. What they've seen is only the surface. What's about to unfold in your life will leave no room for debate. Every delay was on purpose. Every detour was divine. Every rejection was redirection. You didn't lose anything. You were being positioned for something only your frequency could unlock. If this message reached you in the places words can't always reach, then this space was created with you in mind. I want to thank you, deeply and sincerely, for being part of this sacred journey, for showing up, for healing, for listening not just with your ears, but with your spirit. Your presence here matters more than you know. And if you found value in this word, if it resonated with your path, your pain, your process, I humbly invite you to consider supporting this space through a super thanks. But let me be clear, whether you give or not, your support is already felt just by watching, liking, commenting, or simply allowing this message to sit in your soul. You've already sown into something sacred, and I'm grateful for you. Every gift helps us keep these prophetic messages flowing, reaching others like you who are navigating this journey of becoming. But whether you sow financially or not, I bless you all the same. Drop a comment below and let me know what part hit the deepest. Was it the moment you realized your silence was strategy? Was it when you understood that your glow-up was spiritual, not cosmetic? That your comeback wasn't staged, it was ordained? Your words matter. Your testimony could awaken someone else still sleeping through their pain. Share this message with someone who's doubting their light, who's being misjudged because they're walking away from dysfunction. Let them know they're not losing it, they're unlocking it. Let them know they're not broken, they're breaking through. Because this isn't just a video, it's a mirror. It's a moment of remembrance. A reminder that you were never ordinary, you were always chosen, you were always marked. And now the world is finally catching up to what heaven already knew about you. You are not to be underestimated, not to be copied, not to be explained. You are to be witnessed. So rise up, not with noise, but with knowing. Walk into your next chapter, not with fear, but with fire. And may God bless every step you take forward from this moment on. You've always known, welcome home. Chosen one. The world's been waiting for you to remember who you are.